Good morning, and thank you for joining Connected Michigan Communities State Activities Update. This is the third in a series of webinars that we are hosting related to broadband and technology development in the state of Michigan. Today, we're joined by Eric Frederick, the Executive Director of Connected Nation Michigan and the VP of Community Affairs for Connected Nation. Eric, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Wes, for putting this together.
Yeah, it's it's becoming our custom as we do on several of these things, but just a short icebreaker. Do you have any big plans for 2021, or are you just hoping to catch up from 2020?
Yeah, well, that's the way January is going, that's for sure. I can't believe we're scheduling meetings into February already, but no, for this year, definitely, hopefully getting vaccinated soon so we can get over this COVID garbage across the board. But I know that we're going to be busy as an entity trying to expand broadband. I mean, it's especially critical for all of Michiganders to be able to access the internet. So that's going to keep us busy here for what I foresee as the long and the short term for 2021 and beyond.
Yeah, Eric, you may kind of allude to it, but at the state level, I know things are busy, and obviously at the federal level, things have really amped up. And I'll take a moment just to plug that in 2 weeks on February 2nd, we'll actually have some folks that'll be on discussing some of the activities at the federal level, and honestly, even by that point, we may have even a better understanding and idea of what the federal, some of the federal happenings are and how they'll impact the state. So it's good to start and think through that as we discuss today. I'm going to get us on here. Eric, we touched on this back in December, but for anyone that was unable to join us, Connected Nation Michigan or Connected Michigan has been around now for several years. But could you kind of give us a rundown on some of the work that Connected Nation Michigan does, and get us started?
Yeah, sure. So if you're not familiar with our organization, so Connect Michigan, as you may know it, or Connected Nation Michigan, either one, has been around for about a decade now. And we were originally started as a part of the state broadband initiative, partnered with the Michigan Public Service Commission and funded by the Department of Commerce. So we are part of Connected Nation, as part of Connected Nation's family. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. And our mission as a nonprofit is to expand broadband access, adoption, and use to improve quality of life. So because broadband impacts so many facets of our life, whether it's healthcare or education or teleworking or access to services, that's a really big tent to be in, especially right now with everybody dealing with the COVID emergency. So we deal a lot with broadband on every front. We're a kind of an unusual nonprofit in that we don't have large philanthropic benefactors that support our organization. So everything we do is project focused. And in Michigan, that manifests itself in a number of different ways. We're partnered with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation to facilitate the Connecting Michigan Task Force, which I'll talk in detail about here in a minute. We also help the Department of Technology Management and Budget implement the Connecting Michigan Communities Grant Program, which is an infrastructure grant program that was started back in 2018. We're partnered with the Michigan Public Service Commission, and like I said, have been for the last years, to do broadband mapping in the state of Michigan, to do mapping that's better than FCC for broadband coverage. We also have several projects with the Michigan Health Endowment Fund to study telehealth specifically. So we've really, we play in this space quite a bit at the state level to help build the capacity for broadband at the state, build awareness for what's going on, and really build the access, adoption, and use, like I said, of broadband across the state of Michigan.
Thanks. And Eric, I know you had sent over a couple of slides that you kind of wanted to talk about today, and I guess now's a good time to get started on those. I know the first one is that you wanted to talk about, and you mentioned it just a moment ago, was the Connecting Michigan Task Force. Would you kind of fill us in on that?
Yeah, so this is a new venture for the state of Michigan. This task force was launched back in early September. And the Connecting Michigan Task Force, or CMIT, if you will, we have to have an acronym for everything, is made up of 12 different state agencies or entities. And all of these entities deal with broadband in some form or fashion. And the idea behind this task force is to really better coordinate broadband among those agencies, and improve the communication, the use of funds, and monitor what's going on at that federal level for Michigan. So if you saw, there was a press release that was issued by Governor Whitmer back in the fall announcing this task force. So we have representatives from all of these agencies on this task force to really address this problem head on. While we were originally formed to address the broadband as a need for the COVID emergency, it goes beyond that. So back in 2018, the Michigan Consortium of Advanced Networks, or MCAN, was conceived by Governor Snyder, and that group published the 2018 Michigan Broadband Roadmap. And that was the state's first broadband plan in probably, 15 years, I think. So it was due time to have a broadband plan. And in that plan, there was a number of recommendations across several fields to improve broadband. And that was done, of course, at the end of one administration, the beginning of another. But a lot of the recommendations from that document are bipartisan in nature and really look at the core ways to improve Michigan's broadband ecosystem, to expand infrastructure access in rural areas, and to improve broadband adoption, because we can't forget about the issues of affordability and digital literacy and so on. So this group, now that that plan has been out there, this group is tasked with responding to the COVID emergency, but also implementing different projects and programs from that roadmap and others as well as they come up to improve broadband access, adoption, and use for everyone. So again, this is a really diverse group of folks. They're well versed in broadband, and it's really good to have them all around the table to discuss what's going on in their individual agencies, but then collectively work to advocate for Michigan broadband. So not only does that happen at the state level, but it also happens at the federal level. So if you've been watching the COVID relief bills that passed back in December, as well as the federal omnibus spending bill that passed at the same time, there were a number of different broadband things in that bill, and we watched those items very closely to make sure Michigan is taking advantage of those funds and getting its fair share of federal funding. So this group is also here for that, and of course those funds are at the federal level are dispersed among various agencies, and so we too are similarly diverse to make sure that we're looking at all of the opportunities for broadband for Michigan.
Eric, as you talk about what's going on in
again, this is kind of the.
I'm sorry, Eric. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying that this is kind of the first time that we've had this type of coordination for broadband. So it's really nice to see this level of cooperation and representation in this group, and we're working to march a lot of things down the pike.
Yeah, I apologize about that. It had a glitch there for a second. As you mentioned, the things that are going on in Michigan, how does that compare with activities going on in other states?
Yeah, it really does vary greatly from one state to the next. A lot of states have a broadband grant program, for example. I think there's 20 to 30 or so states that have a grant program. I think we're up to 30 now. So we're right along with other states in that fashion. Some states have a state broadband office. We don't have a broadband office per se in Michigan, but this task force kind of takes that role. I think as far as a broadband task force goes, if you're looking at models in other states, ours is probably one of the more diverse that's out there, and largest. So I think we're on the forefront there of trying to de-silo broadband from the various agencies and the pieces and parts that they work on. So that's part of that mission here again. So I think we're on par with what a lot of other states are doing. I think we have some creative things in the works that other states have maybe dabbled in a little bit, but we definitely want to make sure Michigan is at the forefront of broadband and is really implementing the things that can help all Michiganders.
Eric, what do you think is the most significant challenge the state faces with broadband and technology?
Yeah, I think there's two, and it's the biggest ones. It's availability and affordability. And when we're talking about availability, we're talking about the actual physical connection to the infrastructure. Um, Now, when you get right down to it, broadband is simply anything other than dial-up. But as over time and over the last several years, the definition of what broadband is has changed. Our demands on internet service have gone up dramatically over the last several years. So as we demand more and more of our internet connections, the definition of broadband, from a speed perspective, keeps changing. We need faster and faster speeds. So as we look at availability in the state, we need to make sure that we're pushing for networks that can meet not only the needs of households and businesses and institutions right now, but any projected needs, because we know that the demands on our networks are only going to increase over time. So that's part of the challenge, is keeping up with that and making sure that our rural areas have access to the same type of technology that our more urban and more densely populated parts of the states have. And that's a challenge. Infrastructure is expensive to build and deploy. So we need to make sure that the infrastructure that is going out there can meet those needs, and make sure that we're all households, businesses, and institutions are on that level playing field when it comes to availability. The other issue that we have is affordability. So broadband prices are not regulated. And even though infrastructure is available, it doesn't mean that households and businesses and institutions can afford to connect to that infrastructure. When it comes to the adoption of broadband by low-income households and others, affordability is the number one barrier when the infrastructure is available. So how do we make it more affordable? The federal government has the Lifeline program, which can help with a set of pricing with $10 a month for low income or qualifying households. And just recently in the COVID relief bill, there was an additional $50 per month that was passed as part of what's called the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program that the FCC is going to be implementing. The rules are not out for that program yet, but we expect to see that very soon. So that's good news on the affordability front, but that larger federal support only lasts until 6 months after the end of the COVID emergency. So we need to look at the affordability of broadband more holistically and definitely more in the long term to help address that challenge for our low-income and most vulnerable households, to make sure they have access to the technology that they need. So affordability is a huge issue for the state, apart from rural availability as well.
Eric, we've got a couple of questions that have come in specific to, I guess, availability and access to services. What you touched base on some of the things that are being done, and I'm going to flip to your next slide, which represents the what is affectionately known as the RDOF, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. Would you like to kind of speak to that and how what we expect it to do to kind of impact particularly the rural areas of the state?
Yeah, so this fund, which we'll affectionately call RDOF, was a very large subsidy program, and that was implemented in a reverse auction format, and it ended just before Thanksgiving last year. And what happened was the FCC determined census blocks across the country that would be eligible for this fund based on their mapping. Now, there are obviously issues with the way the FCC currently maps broadband coverage, but they used their own data to identify areas that were eligible for this fund. So essentially areas that did not have broadband at 25 by 3 megabits per second. They set a reserve price for those census blocks, and then they opened it up for an auction to allow entities to bid to receive subsidy to serve those census blocks. So this map shows the areas of the state that had winning bidders for them in that auction. It's a lot of the rural areas of the state where service currently is not available. And Michigan had about 250,000 locations that were eligible and won for this auction. and that was third only to California and Texas. So we had the third highest number of locations in the country as a state. So here you can see the companies that bid and won and are going to be rolling out broadband to these areas over the next 6 years. Everything in green on this map is where gigabit level service is going to be deployed. So that's fiber to the premise connections for households and businesses and institutions in these parts of the state. Anything in the orangish red color is, I think, 100 megabits per second at least for service there. So we're going to see we're going to see a big boon of broadband construction over the next 6 years. Now, 6 years it's a long timeline, so we need to try and figure out how do we help expedite the construction of these networks sooner, so that we can get this service out to where it belongs. I'm very hopeful for this program. In Michigan, there's been some conflicting news about some of the bidders in this program. Luckily, we don't have one of those bidders in Michigan that has received the most buzz. So I'm very hopeful for this particular auction and the results to really get broadband out to these areas that need it.
Yeah, and Eric, you mentioned that 6-year time frame. What are there suggestions? And for that matter, you mentioned that one of the things that we need to do is to find ways to help expedite the build in these areas. What are your thoughts on that? Or is there something that the state can or is going to do, or is there things that we would suggest to our communities that they could begin to work towards in that expedition, to help expedite that process?
Yeah, so we've started conversations with the winners of this auction to ask just that. What are the things communities could do? What could the state do? And from a provider perspective, again, talking with them, the things that they said from a community level is making sure that there's an easy to understand and expeditious permitting process to get this infrastructure in the ground. So in these areas, it's going to be mostly working with county road commissions. So making sure that process is known and streamlined and ready to go to receive and approve permits. At the state level, they really talked about two things. One is supply chain and the other is talent. So because this is a national program and the providers across the country are going to be building on this same timeline with the same materials, essentially, fiber, the actual physical fiber is going to be one of the big issues, and being able to get enough fiber to build these connections is going to be a challenge, as well as having the talent on board to be able to construct these networks. So Michigan, of course, has a short construction season, and oftentimes our construction talent will migrate with the season to go where they can construct networks like this year round. So moving the winter, if you will, and so that kind of leaves Michigan at a disadvantage. So how can we ensure that we have enough talent on the ground to build networks that can be built year round without having to lose that contract? So we've been talking with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, who can work on supply chain issues, talking with the Agency for Labor and Economic Opportunity on talent and what training programs there are available to meet the talent and workforce needs of these providers. So that's, those are a few things that the state can work on, and we're going to continue to have those conversations with ISPs, not just these, but ISPs across the state, to see what communities and the state could be doing better to improve that broadband ecosystem.
Eric, it's I've had the fortune to be able to participate and work on some of these projects as well, and so it's easy for us to see a lot of the things that go on at the state level, and I guess the movement that exists there, and the desire amongst collectively the various different agencies and organizations in the state to begin to work together, as you said earlier, to de-silo the conversation around broadband and technology. And so it's exciting to see that happening. In 2021, are there specific things that you really hope that we see from those efforts, and become, not just what may seem to be conversations, but things that we really begin to see having a a groundswell or make a change?
Yeah, I think again it comes back to the availability and the affordability pieces. I think like I said, Michigan has an infrastructure grant program. I'd love to see that expanded and continued. The program received high praise from the legislature last year about its its neutrality and its work and its transparency and getting those grants out the door to areas that really need it. So I'd like to see that continue and get further support. But I also like to see the implementation of an affordability program for low-income and vulnerable households, making they have access to broadband. I think that's going to be key as we move into this, even in a post-COVID environment. A lot of things are still going to be done virtually, whether that's teleworking or distance learning or telehealth. Those three things are absolutely key, and I don't think they're going to go away after COVID is done. So I really want to get those two pieces in place to address the biggest challenges of the state, as well as other things to improve broadband's, again, overall broadband ecosystem. I mean, I think that's the key, is making a friendly environment for broadband to expand and empowering those that can expand broadband, whether it's a public, private, or otherwise, to do so. And I think that's going to be key moving forward, that we're not just looking at siloed technologies or siloed ways of expanding broadband, that we look at all options and all entities for improving broadband.
And Eric, before we get into time for Q&A, is there anything else that you want to, that we haven't touched on that you want to touch on?
Yeah, so there was a question about mapping, and mapping is an interesting piece. So we've been mapping broadband in Michigan for 10 years, 11 now actually, because we started in 2010. And so the FCC maps broadband. They collect information from internet service providers, and it's published at a census block level. We in Michigan take that information, and we then contact every single internet service provider in the state and try to gather more granular information from them. There is no requirement for internet service provider to give us anything else other than what is provided to the FCC. So the maps that we produce are better than what the FCC has, but we're still hamstrung by our ability to either force or entice providers to participate in a more granular mapping service to create a more accurate product. So we know there's issues with the maps. I mean, it's a known issue. We are very hopeful and glad to see that in the COVID relief bill that was passed in December, that there was funding appropriated to the FCC to implement a more granular broadband mapping process at the federal level. And that would provide every state more accurate granular broadband maps. I'm part of the NTIA's State Broadband Leaders Network, and that group has been advocating for such efforts for a long time. Other states don't have their own, some states don't have their own mapping program, so they just rely on what the federal government has. And that can be an issue for them. Ours is a little bit better, but we still know there's errors. So by changing the way broadband is mapped at a federal level, it raises all ships, if you will, because every state will have access to more accurate granular data. Now, the problem is that it's still a long ways off. The funding was appropriated. The FCC is going to have to go through a process to get the rules and regulations for that program set up and created. So we're still looking at 24 to 30 months before the first data set of this new mapping methodology is published. However, we're very hopeful that that will help. Now, I know that doesn't do anything for us in the short term. So what we continue to do in the short term is make sure we try to get our maps as accurate as we can. It's getting crowdsourced or bottom-up type data can be challenging. So there's lots of moving parts when it comes to broadband mapping. But I guess the short answer is we're trying to do our best, and we're hopeful for what's on the horizon for mapping at the federal level.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, where the next webinar we'll be doing in the early part of February, we'll touch on some of those federal efforts, which will certainly include what the FCC is doing. And then we're working to make sure that we can provide a kind of a bigger overview in the following webinar later in February. That would be a mapping overview that really kind of digs a little bit deeper into what has been done in the state and how that federal level mapping effort impacts the state and the efforts that we have organizationally to provide a as quality of a broadband mapping product as we can for the state. Some of the intricacies and the the ins and outs of the things that we deal with as we receive information and try to update and keep the maps up to date. And then as you mentioned, just there are some it's not the most perfect mapping product, and as I've mentioned many times with folks, particularly with broadband mapping, if the map were perfect today, it would probably be imperfect tomorrow, because there's constantly changes being made to networks and new areas being served and so on and so forth. I do want to encourage folks to continue to send in some questions as we are going through this. As we get into some questions, we had one come in that says, can you speak a little more about the implications of having inaccurate maps? And we've spoken about it a little bit, but anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about federal and even state subsidies, having the inaccurate maps, if especially if maps are overstated, then it will preclude areas from being eligible for those funds. Now, the way the Michigan Connecting Michigan Communities Grant Program is set up is that the state doesn't deem areas as eligible or not eligible. It's just the area can't have service at 25/3 to be eligible. We want the unserved areas, but that grant program has a comment and objection period. So if there was a grant application through and they're recommended for funding, then a comment and objection window would be triggered for 60 days, where anybody who already provides service in that proposed grant area can say, hey, I already provide service here, you shouldn't fund it. So that effort helps us really fine tune where those grants are going and making sure that they're going to areas that are that are eligible. But that doesn't happen at a federal level a lot of times. It will for some of the smaller federal grants like the USDA's Reconnect program and others to some extent. But the FCC, like I said, especially for the RDOF auction, used their very inaccurate maps to determine eligibility for this RDOF auction. So there were lots of areas that were left out of it. So that's part of the trouble of those inaccurate maps, is making sure that those areas are eligible. And the FCC, I think, that's where the biggest issue lies at the moment, which I said is going to be fixed. But at a state level, there's ways that we can help mitigate that some, but it takes a very grassroots, hands-on approach to do
that. Eric, another question that came in is more specific to how to work with community or work with broadband providers. And the question is, how can we locally get internet companies to talk with locals about expansion? They mentioned that there's a fiber running through an area that has no broadband, but the company will not talk to them. And so, most likely the fiber that's being discussed here is probably some sort of backhaul infrastructure or trunking infrastructure that's being utilized by a provider for their core network. But any suggestions?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, every has their own communications frameworks, their own corporate structures. Especially the larger multinational, multi-state providers are much harder to get in touch with. We some connections with those providers that could help that conversation. So if you want to contact us, and we could see if we have any contacts at some of the larger companies. We found that a lot of the Michigan-based companies or smaller internet service providers are much more willing to talk, but it just happens that you got to find the right person. So we could help with that as well. It can be very challenging, again, because we're talking about something that's a private sector utility. But without the regulatory framework of a regular utility, it'd be tough to get in touch with those entities. I know the Michigan Public Service Commission maintains a database of internet service providers and contact information in the state, so that could be a place to look as well. But I would say if you have a specific provider in mind, feel free to reach out to us, and we can see if we have a decent contact there that could help.
Um, Eric, as I'm looking through some of the questions that have come through, one that's popped up here is thoughts on the certainty of these networks. I'm assuming probably pointing at the RDOF opportunity or the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. The certainty that we have on those networks being built.
Yeah. So looking at the winners for the RDOF auction in Michigan, I'm pretty happy with who bid and won. I mean, I feel like we're going to have pretty good results from the RDOF auction based on these companies. We had a lot of rural electric cooperatives that bid and won. They bid as a consortium, but they're individual entities in the state. So I'm very confident in those. I know that the big one at the national level was LTD broadband, acronym. And there was a question about they're a fixed wireless company, but they were proposing fiber, like isolated fiber projects all over the country, and that there was an issue there. We don't have that in Michigan as part of the RDOF auction, so I'm pretty confident in the results of the auction here. But of course, we'll be watching it pretty closely and making sure, and we want to track when these networks are getting deployed so that we can make sure people are aware and are getting connected. So we'll be watching that pretty closely, as well as the national conversation as well.
Sure. Hey, Eric, again, just looking through here, what role can local governments or townships play in promoting rural access while waiting for granular federal mapping? Just made mention the township does not want to become an ISP.
Yeah, and I'll answer with one of the issues that was raised earlier is making sure you know who your ISPs are, and making sure that you're having open conversations with them about what their expansion plans are. Again, with the national providers, it can be very difficult to find that local person who may not even be willing to talk about what their expansion plans are. But I think that's the key first step, is making sure you know them. And if you can identify unserved areas of the township, and talk with them about, why can't you expand here? Do you plan to expand there? Asking those very open questions about it, I think is a great way to start. Another thing that I think local governments can do, and we've seen this in a couple places, is work on partnerships. We've seen townships get involved with broadband in a couple different ways. And it really exists on a spectrum. I mean, there's all the way from being your own ISP to doing nothing. So there's lots of gray area in between where local communities can do something. We've seen where in Linden Township in Washtenaw County, where they passed a millage to build a fiber network to everyone in the community. It was like a $8.5 million millage, I think, or somewhere around there, to build the fiber network, and then lease that network to an ISP. They didn't want to be the ISP, but they put up the funds to build the network because the private sector couldn't make that investment work. So that's on one end of the spectrum. And then somewhere in the middle, we've seen where townships have partnered with wireless providers to identify either existing towers, build new towers, or identify more non-traditional vertical assets to host wireless equipment. So there's a lot of different things that a local community can do, but it all starts with that communication with ISPs, and looking at what are some things that the community what are the things the community can bring to the table to help that provider make the case for expansion. Because as household density decreases, so does service, and then the cost of deployment goes up. So impacting either side of that equation is where the community can come in and help build that partnership.
And Eric, there's a question come in that I think that kind of extends that question, or extends some of this, and that's, is there any consideration being given to creating an environment so units of government, state or local, can build their own broadband infrastructure as a utility, utilizing grant funding to augment this approach? And they mentioned, some of the things that have happened in Colorado since changing some of the state laws around utilities and whatnot, and their ability to build broadband networks.
Yeah, so in Michigan, Michigan does not outright preclude municipal broadband. We have some rules on the books that include an RFP process and so on, but we do not outright ban municipal broadband. The City of Holland has done it through their electric utility, the village of Sebewing up in the Thumb area. They've done it through their electric utility. I know there's others that have been looking to. City of Portland was looking at doing broadband through their local, community-owned utility. So we don't outright ban it. However, in the Connecting Michigan Communities grant legislation, that grant can't go to government or educational entities. That's unfortunate. That was passed as part of the legislation. So it's not, it wasn't set up in the rules and regulations. It was part of the legislation that precluded public entities from taking part in that grant. Now that goes to that said that a community wouldn't preclude them from partnering with an ISP on a build, but the funding itself can't go to a government entity. So unfortunately, that's where the local grant program falls. Some of the federal programs, well, RDOF again was awarded to internet service providers, but there's other federal grants where public entities can be the applicant or can be a strong in the applicant or in the application for those programs, and we watch those pretty closely as well.
Thank you. Eric, there's a question over in the chat that's curious how connected Michigan corresponds with Merit's moonshot framework, how we work with one another, so on and so forth.
Yeah, so we are not part of the moonshot framework. It's two separate entities. Merit is an internet service provider that provides connections to institutions, schools, healthcare, libraries across the state. They've been around since the 60s. They were one of the first major educational networks in the country. And their moonshot framework is a great way to for communities to organize around broadband. But we are separate. We are two separate entities. But so their program is focused on communities and getting the connections out there that they need. But again, we're just two different entities. But we do coordinate with Merit. We have a standing monthly call to update each other on what's going on, simply because they're a fixture of broadband in the state and provide those critical connections to institutions.
And I think we've got one more question that we'll try to touch base on, and the question comes in a COVID environment. What are any suggestions for communicating to rural residents? Community organizations like churches, schools, community groups. I think it's a great question, just because as you try to organize in a rural area, so many of our normal communication avenues have essentially been shut off or limited. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think all of those suggestions are good. I think those organizations in the community are best to reach the most vulnerable populations. I would also say that add in senior centers to that list is a great way to connect with folks. Any of the NGOs that serve vulnerable populations, I think would be good as well. Community action agencies, phenomenal group of entities to reach out and communicate into rural residents. Michigan Works offices, similarly, those entities I think would be great for trying to communicate and try to cover, if you will, all of the different, the residents, rural residents during the time of COVID. I think community groups are one of the best ways to do that. Yeah.
Well, Eric, we've certainly run up on our time here. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and Eric, you taking the time today to talk with us about what's going on at the state level. As I mentioned earlier, we will have another webinar, and in fact, we'll have webinars bi-weekly for the next several months. February 2nd is our next one, and we'll be discussing what's going on at the federal level. There's been some discussion today about that, but we'll kind of dig into the various different things that are going on legislatively, as well as with the FCC, and how they may impact our state. And then I also want to let everybody know we've started a podcast. That podcast actually, Eric mentioned earlier, the CMIT task force. We're releasing a few of those podcasts that actually are interviews with the task force members, and that will launch last week, and those will be coming out every few days. So good chance to hear specifically from our CMIT task force members, their thoughts on how we expand connectivity and broadband technology services in the state, and really kind of what drives them and their passion for specifically this topic. I want to thank everybody again today, and with that, we'll wrap it today. Everyone have a great one.
Thanks, everyone.